After Rome finally defeated Carthage, they began to look in a different direction. The east, where Macedonia and other Hellenistic kingdoms still held considerable power. The idea was simple. If we've already dominated the west, why not take control of the other side as well? And that's how the Macedonian Wars started. At the center of it all was King Philip V, an ambitious figure who also sought to expand his control in the region. Tensions between Rome and Macedonia began to rise when both realized they wanted to dominate the same regions, especially Greece. Rome, having just emerged victorious against Carthage, knew that to continue growing, it needed to defeat the Hellenistic kingdoms. Philip V, on the other hand, had his own expansion plans and wasn't going to let Rome take his territory without a fight. When Rome won against Carthage and stabilized its hold over the western Mediterranean, they turned their attention to Philip V. Now it's your turn, they thought. The Romans didn't like anyone trying to seize territory, especially when they were busy with another war. They knew Macedonia needed to be taught a lesson. Thus, the wars began, and Rome had a clear goal: to put Philip in his place and show who really ruled the Mediterranean. Philip V still believed he could hold off Rome, and Macedonia did indeed have a strong army. But the Romans were operating on a whole new level of ambition. They were no longer satisfied with merely defending their lands. Now, they wanted to be the masters of the game. This take-it-all mentality marked the beginning of the Macedonian Wars. Rome knew that if they controlled the East, they could dominate trade, routes, and everything else the Hellenistic kingdoms possessed. It was an opportunity they weren't going to miss. Thus, the great rivalry between Rome and the Macedonian kingdoms began. The struggle that started with Philip V wouldn't be easy, but Rome was more determined than ever to expand its empire. The First Macedonian War began when Philip V, King of Macedonia, saw Rome expanding and thought, "If I don't do something, they'll soon be knocking on my door." He wanted to strengthen his position in the region, especially in Greece, and sought allies. However, while he was making his moves, Rome was keeping a close eye. The Romans weren't naive. They had already understood that Macedonia was a threat, and after their victory over Carthage, they were ready for any move Philip made. Unlike what happened with Carthage, this first war wasn't filled with grand battles. Rome was more focused on weakening Philip politically. They allied with some Greek cities, trying to isolate Macedonia. The trick here was playing the alliance game, and Rome excelled at that. While Philip was trying to expand his territory, Rome was closing doors on him. The war dragged on for several years, but the truth is, neither side emerged as a clear winner. In the end, the Treaty of Phenice was signed in 205 BC, which brought about a temporary peace. But you know how it is, right? That kind of peace with an underlying taste of revenge. Rome wasn't satisfied, and frankly, neither was Philip. Both sides knew that this truce wouldn't last. Despite the treaty, the situation remained tense. Philip V hadn't given up on expanding his kingdom, and Rome was becoming increasingly certain that sooner or later they'd have to come back and settle the score with Macedonia once and for all. The First Macedonian War ended without any major victories, but everyone knew the conflict wasn't over. It didn't take long for the confrontation to resurface. The Second Macedonian War began around 200 BC, when Philip V, more stubborn than ever, decided to keep trying to expand his power in Greece. He believed that despite the peace treaty, there was still room to grow his holdings, but here came the old mistake: underestimating Rome. This time, Rome had more time and resource. They had resolved their issues in the Western Mediterranean and were now ready to face Philip head-on. The difference in this war compared to the first was that now the Romans weren't just playing the political game of alliances. They were ready for direct combat. What they wanted was to settle the matter once and for all. Philip V tried to hold off the Roman advance, but it was difficult. The alliances he had in Greece weren't enough, and Rome was growing both militarily and politically. With more allies and a well-trained army, the Romans began pushing Macedonia into a corner. Philip tried to resist, but he knew the fight wasn't going in his favor. The war was drawing to a close, and Rome started to apply more pressure. They knew that a total victory wouldn't just weaken Macedonia, it would also pave the way for them to control the entire region of Greece. It was only a matter of time before Philip V realized that his kingdom was on the brink. The Battle of Cynoscephalae in 197 BC was the moment when Philip V realized his luck was running out. Rome had been applying pressure, and this battle was going to decide everything. On the battlefield, the tension was palpable. On one side were the Macedonian soldiers with their famous phalanxes, those compact formations with gigantic spears, and on the other side were the Roman legions, ready to strike. The atmosphere was tense, and it was clear that something big was about to happen. At the start, Philip was holding his own quite well. The phalanxes were as powerful as ever, keeping the Roman advance at bay. But then the problem began. The terrain. The hilly region of Cynoscephalae didn't favor the Macedonians at all. The rough terrain hindered the phalanxes' movements, while the Romans, with their more flexible legions, took full advantage of the situation. While the phalanx needed to stay tight and organized, the Romans could move quickly and strike from various angles. The battle was intense. Shouts, soldiers falling on all sides, and the clash of spears and swords filled the air with an atmosphere of sheer chaos. Philip V tried to maintain control, but when the Romans began flanking his troops, everything fell apart. The phalanxes, which usually stood as an impenetrable wall, started to break down, and the Macedonians couldn't hold their ground. When the phalanx collapsed, chaos ensued. The Romans advanced relentlessly, and Philip's army began to crumble. What had started as a seemingly balanced fight turned into a massacre. Philip V watched as his army was utterly defeated, knowing that Macedonia would never be the same after this battle. After the victory at Cynoscephalae, Philip V had no choice but to accept Rome's terms, and those terms weren't light. Philip lost much of his control over Greece and was forbidden from interfering in any affairs outside his borders. It was as if Rome had placed Macedonia in a form of time-out, saying, "Now you stay quiet in your corner." But the biggest blow was to Philip's pride. Once a powerful king, he was now overshadowed by Rome. His army was destroyed, and what was left of Macedonia was but a shadow of its former self. Despite this, Philip was able to keep his throne, though with significantly less power and influence. From Rome's perspective, this victory brought even more prestige. They had demonstrated to the entire Mediterranean that they could defeat enemies not just in the west, but in the east as well. Rome was no longer merely an expanding city-state. It was a force capable of toppling kingdoms that had long dominated the region. Now everyone knew messing with Rome was risky. Even with the peace that followed the battle, it was clear that things weren't completely settled. Macedonia remained quiet for a time, but the resentment lingered, especially within Philip V's heart. And although the kingdom was weakened, it still existed. It was only a matter of time before someone would challenge Rome again. After Philip V's defeat, Macedonia lay low for quite a while, trying to recover bit by bit. But the bitterness over losing power was still there. Philip V, who died in 179 BC, of natural causes, left his son Perseus on the throne. And Perseus had no intention of leaving things as they were. He wanted to restore Macedonia's power, and he knew that to do so, he would have to face Rome once again. Perseus was just as ambitious as his father, but he tried to act with more caution. For a time, he secretly formed alliances and rebuilt Macedonia's army. He wanted to be ready for the right moment to challenge Rome. However, Rome, ever watchful, knew that Macedonia hadn't fully accepted its defeat, and that the conflict wasn't truly over. Then, in 171 BC, the Third Macedonian War began. Perseus believed he could achieve what his father couldn't: defeat Rome and restore Macedonia's glory. He gathered allies, built a strong army, and was confident. But Rome was now even more powerful, with more resources and experience. The war started with a few small skirmishes, and Perseus even managed a few early victories, giving hope to his people. However, the Romans were persistent and knew how to turn the tide. It wouldn't be any different this time. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BC was the moment Perseus realized that his dream of restoring the power of Macedonia was about to end. He still had hope, thinking he could stand against Rome, but what happened at Pydna showed a very different outcome. Perseus arrived confidently with his Macedonian phalanxes, those soldiers with enormous spears lined up in tight formations that had always been formidable to enemies. But there was a problem. The terrain at Pydna was uneven, filled with hills, and those phalanxes worked best on flat ground. You can already imagine what happened. As the phalanxes struggled to organize, the Roman legions quickly spotted the weak points. The Romans knew how to attack the flanks, and that's exactly what they did. At first, it seemed like Perseus might hold his ground. The phalanxes held firm for a while, but as the difficult terrain hindered their movements and the Romans began to encircle them, things got ugly. The phalanxes, which usually stood like a solid wall, began to crumble. And when that line broke, chaos ensued. The Romans charged in full force, and it became a slaughter. Perseus' soldiers tried to hold on, but it was impossible. What seemed like solid defense turned into a desperate retreat. Seeing his army fall apart, Perseus tried to flee with what was left of his troops. But the truth was, he had already lost. Macedonia collapsed that day, and there was nothing left to rebuild. It was the end of an era. After the devastating defeat at Pydna, Macedonia would never be the same. Perseus, who dreamed of restoring his kingdom's power, was captured. And it wasn't just a military loss, it was the complete end of Macedonia as an independent kingdom. With Perseus imprisoned, the Romans did what they always did after winning a war. They dismantled the kingdom and divided it into smaller regions to ensure no one could ever rise again. The Macedonians, who had long been a feared power, were now under Roman control. They were no longer a threat, merely another region under Roman dominion. To make sure no one would dare to revolt again, Rome appointed local rulers, but all under strict Roman supervision. Nothing happened without Rome's say-so. And what about Perseus? He was taken to Rome as a war trophy, paraded through the streets, humiliated in front of the Roman people, who loved to see defeated enemies displayed as part of their victory celebrations. This was Rome's way of showing who was in charge. Perseus, who dreamed of defeating Rome, was now just a prisoner, and his kingdom was nothing more than a part of history. For Rome, this victory was more than just winning a battle. It showed the entire Mediterranean that anyone who dared to challenge Roman power would meet the same fate: defeat and domination. Macedonia, which had long been a powerful kingdom, was now fragmented, with Rome in control of everything. With the fall of Macedonia, Rome was no longer just a power in Italy. They were now dominating the Mediterranean from end to end. And this opened up a world of possibilities, but it also brought a huge problem: how to manage such a vast territory. The lands that once belonged to the Greek and Macedonian kingdoms were now under Roman rule, and they needed to ensure everything functioned their way. The solution Rome came up with was to start spreading Roman governors across these new regions, overseeing everything from tax collection to ensuring no one would rebel. And if anyone tried to outsmart them and rise against their rule, they knew what was coming. The Roman army would arrive to settle things. Rome didn't take things lightly, but managing Macedonia wasn't a walk in the park. The people there were proud, and keeping everyone in line was tough. Roman soldiers were everywhere, making sure nobody acted out of turn. Additionally, with Rome now controlling the Mediterranean, they also dominated the most important trade routes of the time, which brought immense wealth to the empire. But growing so fast came at a cost. Rome needed more soldiers, more governors, and a larger structure to hold everything together. They were expanding at such a rapid pace that one could wonder, how long can they keep this up? After dominating Macedonia, Rome was far from satisfied. If you thought they would stop there, you're May. The Romans, as ambitious as ever, started looking east. The idea? Keep expanding, conquer more lands, and show the world who really ruled. They already controlled the Mediterranean, but they knew that in the east there were vast lands and riches waiting to be taken. But the east was no easy task. There were strong powers there too. Kingdoms like Syria and Egypt were powerful and prepared for a fight. Yet Rome, after everything they had faced, wasn't going to be intimidated. For them, it was just a matter of time before they expanded their empire even further. With the East as their target, it was only a matter of choosing the right moment to strike. The funny thing is that even though they knew it was getting harder to manage so much territory, Rome didn't stop. The more land they had, the more they wanted. Was it hard to govern all these conquests? Sure. But the Roman Empire wasn't one to give up easily. They kept pushing forward, with the mindset that the world had to be theirs. Now, with their eyes set on the East, Rome was ready for more. What started as a small city had turned into a giant empire, and anyone who dared to stand in their way knew they would face an unstoppable war machine. Rome was just getting started. With Rome expanding more and more, the empire was growing at an impressive rate, but that also brought internal and external challenges. Want to know how they dealt with it all and how far they went? Then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There are many more fascinating stories on the way.